Well, we had some very interesting results in an election in Germany just recently. Yesterday, there was a state election in Thuringia, which is a pretty small German state in what used to be East Germany. And it is noteworthy to us today because the Thuringians decided to completely rebuke the establishment parties in Germany and gave more than 50% of their votes to anti-establishment parties. In fact, the two major parties in Germany, the parties that materialized after World War II in the West and then eventually, spread to the East after the fall of communism, are the Christian Democratic Union and the Social Democrats. Both of these parties combined only won about 30% of the vote in Thuringia. Less than 1/3 of the people in Thuringia voted for one of the two major parties, which is it is a parliamentary country, so it's not quite as remarkable as it would be if, say, only in America there was an election where the Republican and the Democrat only won about 30% combined. It's not that extreme, but it's still quite notable. Especially when you consider that, there have been times in German history to where the CDU was able to rule, with no coalition partners in the country because they had, more than 50% of the vote all by themselves. And while the CDU is still hanging on in most of Germany, they're still a very large party. They are, of course, have been the governing party there for as long as I can remember. I believe Merkel took over in 2005, something like that. And of course, she was preceded by an SPD chancellor there. But again, that has nothing to do with this election because this was a local election. An election in a state that the CDU controlled without question. From 1992, when it was democratized after the fall of communism, until 2014, in which they lost to the far left, which is it's called the party's just actually called the left, and their constituency are people who are, from what I understand, nostalgic for old communism. The people who are they call them the East German boomers. The people who remember East Germany and think, what, I liked where I lived, and I'd like to go back to those times. And so they vote for these, sort of wishy-washy pseudo-communists who call themselves the left. And that's been the governing party now since the last election in 2014. That was the first time that the CDU lost the election. But they're doing even worse now, because not only did they fail again to become the largest party in Thuringia, they're now the third largest party, behind not only the left, but also the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland. And the AfD, like the left is the anti-establishment sort of alternative left party. The AfD is the anti-establishment right party. And so now it is no longer the case that the CDU and the SPD, the center-right and center-left parties, rule and are the largest parties in Thuringia. Now it is the so-called far-left and far-right parties that are the two major parties in this state. And so let's go over exactly, now that I've sort of explained the situation, what the exact vote totals were. So the left party, which is, they were the biggest party in the 2014 election. They're already sort of in charge of the government. I believe they call them minister president in Germany. They already control that, so they they are the head of the state government. They came out with 31% of the vote, so almost a third. Which, considering that there are several parties here, that's a pretty good showing. 1/3 of the vote. Next, in second place, came the AfD at 23.4%, and then third, the CDU at 21.8%. And then, of course, all the way in fourth, in the single digits, the former, second biggest party in Germany, a very important party in Germany since, for as long as they've had elections, essentially, since, the Second Reich, the unification of Germany in the 1870s, one of the most important parties, the SPD, 8.2%. I mean, that's just, and if you look at the change in the vote totals or the percentage totals, it looks pretty clearly like you're seeing a shift in the from the CDU and the SPD directly to the AFD and the left, because if you look at the percentage drop in the vote that the CDU got, it's relatively close to the increase in the vote for the AFD in percentage terms, not in absolute terms, and I'll get to that because turnout was higher in this election. And the same is true with the SPD. The SPD lost about as much in terms of percentage, about 4%, as the left gained. And then, of course, because the way German politics works is you always have you've had your center left and your center right parties, but then you also have your junior center left and center right parties, the junior partners that normally would form a coalition with the bigger left or right party, and those, of course, the left and the right junior parties respectively are the Greens and the Free Democrats. Both of those parties got about 5%, and so they'll both be in Parliament. Or I guess parliament isn't the right term. They call it the Landtag. And so, the SPD, I think, feels a bit more beat down because they've been doing very poorly lately. I think they're pretty much used to losing and losing badly. The CDU, it still hasn't quite, hit home yet that, they're being displaced by the AFD and that their voters are leaving them. And that new voters who have felt disenfranchised and left behind by the CDU and the SPD are coming out in force to vote for the left and for the AFD, and that's why you see turnout has increased substantially since the 2014 elections in Thuringia, up from 52% to 66%. So that's 2/3 of all the people in this state came out for this election. I can't think of the last time I ever heard of a U.S. state getting even 66% of the people out for a presidential election, let alone for the midterms where it's only state and local officials on the ballot. Now it'll be interesting to see what sort of coalition comes out of this, because of course to form a government in a parliamentary system you need to put together a coalition of at least 50% plus one of the seats in the legislature. And currently there's a coalition between the left, the SPD, and the Greens, all of the center left to left parties. They came together and formed their little coalition, and combined they make up, after the 2014 election, they made up over 50% of the seats in Parliament. Well, that's no longer the case. I added up their totals, and at least in the vote totals, they're only at 45%. So they will still have to bring in another partner to form their coalition. I don't know. Maybe they can get the FDP in for some reason. But we know one thing for sure, and that is that the AFD, no matter what, will not be in any of the governments. Let's say the CDU wanted to try and form a government, that their natural partners would be the FDP and the AFD. But and this is the one thing that sets the AFD apart from the left, is that they're considered far more toxic. The left, it's kind of okay to be nostalgic about communism, but the AFD, well, they're literally Hitler, so nobody can talk to them. That's taboo. Nobody can ever form a coalition with them, even though we see in these elections the AFD is getting more and more of the vote, so it's becoming much more difficult for them to be ignored. And of course, the reason why the AFD is excluded from all these coalitions, even though they have a lot of seats in all these legislatures, or not all of them, but many of them, is because of a direct Nazi comparison that people like to make. Because a lot of people blame Hitler's rise to power on one of the German chancellors who, invited Hitler to join his coalition at some point because, he thought that Hitler was better than the communists, so he'd rather form a coalition with the Nazis, even though he didn't like any of them. And of course, that man is blamed for helping Hitler rise to power. And the idea is that, well, if Hitler was never allowed into a governing coalition, he would have never been able to, amass more power from there. And so people say, well, we have to stop the AFD, because if they don't, they'll take over and we'll be living in the Fourth Reich. And I don't think that that there's any danger of the AFD, taking over any in winning any big national election victory anytime soon. And that's because, so much of the country is controlled by, the West Germans. The AfD does very well in East Germany. And I think many people would say that the reason why the AfD and the left, the more what is considered far left and far right in Germany, those parties do well because the eastern part of Germany, former East Germany, is a young democracy. Meaning that they don't have all these democratic norms are still new to them. They've only had democracy since the 90s. And so they're not nearly as stable and as enlightened as the West Germans. And of course, they're belittling people when they talk like that. When they talk about how, certain countries are less stable because they're a young democracy. What they mean by that is that in mature democracies, the voters are much more easy and docile. And the voters understand that, being a mature democracy means that you vote for the establishment every time. No matter how many times they screw you over, you never vote for anyone else. And you just let your rulers rule you how they see fit. Being a mature democracy is about choosing between Coke or Pepsi, not between, Coke, Pepsi, or Dr. Pepper. I mean, Dr. Pepper, if you choose that, what's wrong with you? And that's what a lot of East Germans are doing when they vote for the AfD or the left. They're saying, you know what, I'm just not a big fan of this whole cola thing. I'd like something different. Maybe I'd like to give these guys a try who haven't had a chance to screw me over yet. And maybe if they screw me over, I'll vote for someone else. And of course, we Americans figured this out pretty well when, even though I didn't vote for Donald Trump, when a lot of people decided, hey, you know what, we're kind of tired of this Coke and Pepsi paradigm. We want a nice ice-cold glass of Dr. Pepper in the form of Donald J. Trump. And what has the media and the establishment been screaming ever since Trump was elected? Well, they said, oh my gosh, our democracy is under threat. And you'd think, well, that's totally dumb. He was fairly elected. What do you mean democracy is under threat? What they mean by democracy is under threat is that to them, democracy means they are in charge. That's what democracy is to these people. Democracy is not a choice. Democracy is just how they rule you. Democracy has, for many decades in the West, been merely the means by which the establishment parties validate their authority. And so the establishment parties in Germany right now are finding out that, maybe that's not such a sure thing anymore. Maybe our powers are not absolute. And even though some of them are starting to wake up to that, they're not waking up fast enough to change their behavior and to try and compete. They're very quickly being eroded. The SPD, frankly, very soon will no longer be a viable major party. And, the CDU better wake up, or else they're going to be the ones that, that are next. And then pretty soon you're going to have, I guess, the left running the country because no one will ever form a coalition with the AfD. Because, the AfD has won over 20% and ended up being the second party before in two other East German states this year, in Saxony and Brandenburg. And still, they're not in any governing coalition because, the parties are sticking by their pact never to let them in. So it'll be interesting to see how long they can keep that up because, the AfD now is a lot more effective and popular and powerful than they were a few years ago when the major parties decided, to make that pact that, we'll never let the AfD into a coalition. Well, back then they were dinks. I don't believe they even had any seats in the Bundestag until the last general election of 2017. I think that was the first time they were able to actually get over the 5% threshold. So anyway, I think I'll end it here. If you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.